Today's episode is going to be focusing on sexual assault and rape. We understand that for some of you, these topics can be offensive or even triggering. Therefore, if you do not want to listen anymore, please go ahead and turn this episode off now. Also, if you or a loved one has been the victim of sexual assault, please call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673. That's 1-800-656-4673. Welcome to another episode of the Victory of Vices podcast, brought to you commercial-free by addictionhelp.com. I am your host, Dan Hauser, and on this episode, we're going to have a conversation about sexual assault in sports. A couple years ago, that Larry Nassar case, I think, brought to the forefront and brought to a lot of people's attention just how prevalent and also underreported sexual assault is in sports. While that was obviously a very big case and a very important case to bring to everyone's attention, it's also important to remember that sexual assault in sports was happening long before the Larry Nassar case. And unfortunately, that case has not stopped it from happening, as we've seen here. About in the last 18 to 24 months, we've seen many, many more stories coming out, which we will get to later on in the show. And so in all these stories, in a lot of cases, we see athletes being the aggressors in sexual assault, but also in specifically in that Larry Nassar case and some of these other cases we'll be talking about a little bit later on, they are actually the victims. And in the latter, when they are the victims, typically the aggressor is somebody in a position of power, whether it be a coach, a mentor, a boss, somebody that the victim looks up to, they trust, they think that they have their best interests in mind, but that's not always the case. Also, it typically tends to be somebody that is in power and can have a direct control over their successes or failures with their careers, which is why, unfortunately, it also goes unreported in so many circumstances until it is too late, at least for that specific individual or situation. And so when we come back from the break, I'm going to have Dr. Natalie Klag from The Ohio State University's Wexner Medical Center on to have a conversation with me today about sexual assault in sports. And we'll take a look at some of the more recent examples that have come up in the news, like I said, over these last 18 to 24 months. We'll also look at the mental health side from both the victim and the aggressor and try to get a better understanding of what is going through the mind of both parties, both before, during, and after the assault takes place. So we'll be right back. All right, welcome back to the show. I am joined by Dr. Natalie Klag, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at The Ohio State University's Wexner Medical Center. Natalie, thank you so much for coming on with me again today.
Happy to be here.
I mean, at this point, you're basically a show regular.
Yeah. I should go from guest star to get my name in the regular credits.
Right. I mean, but that just goes to show your versatility as far as your knowledge, your vast knowledge of all these important topics that we discuss on a regular basis here on the Victor of Vices podcast. So today it won't be as chipper or cheery. Not that most of our topics aren't, but there's usually somewhere in there where there's something on the positive side. Not so much for today, but hopefully we can do this in a way that will make it, I guess, as enjoyable as possible for you, the viewers and listeners, to follow along with us. Obviously, it's like I mentioned up top, it's a serious subject, but I think it's one that definitely needs to be talked about, especially as we get into here in a minute. Just how prevalent this is, as far as how prevalent it is compared to how prevalent I think the general public thinks it is. And so, right out of the gate, I think let's just throw some statistics out there just to kind of make the audience aware just how major of a deal this is, so to say, sexual assault within sports specifically. And so not just in sports, too, outside of sports. And so these statistics that I'm going to throw out here real quick are from the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. And so some of these were even jarring to me as I was kind of preparing for the show and pulling some of these statistics. Specifically, every 68 seconds in this country, someone is sexually assaulted. So think about it. In the time it took me to read that, basically somebody, unfortunately, was the victim of sexual assault. And every 9 minutes, that victim is a child, which disheartening, sickening, choose your verb of just how awful that is that you want to throw out there. Yearly, on average, there are more than 460,000 victims ages 12 and older of rape and sexual assault in the United States. And over half of those victims are under the age of 30. So, and you'll see this correlation a little more as we get into some more of our stories. It's very common that these victims are, like you mentioned, under the age of 30, typically in their teen and early 20 years, college age, maybe, freshly out of college, especially we see here in the sports world. One out of every 6 women currently living in this country has been a victim of at least an attempted sexual assault in their lifetime, which another just truly jarring number. There's a bunch others here. We'll get to more of them in a minute. Natalie, I know you said you found some that were particularly of interest to you as well, if you'd like to share some of those.
Yeah. So, one of the things with these that struck me is, looking through these statistics, we use the word, assault versus harassment versus rape. All of these things are words that I think often get interchanged. And one of the things that really struck me is like with these statistics, looking at like the numbers they're giving and what they're saying is happening, it almost, to me, I'm like a little skeptical about the statistics, thinking like, when we use these words interchangeably, like, are we getting a full picture of how serious this is? Like, I thought it was interesting. One of the things I did was look up the difference between like assault and harassment, just so that I knew and could like speak more like accurately about those things. Because I think when we conflate them, we often risk like not verifying or validating the experience of someone. So like harassment is any unwanted verbal or physical sexual attention, whereas like sexual abuse is more like the physical act where consent isn't there. And so I think like these are all talking about assault. So like when we think about assault, it's like that physical experience. But when you think about harassment, like that's someone like giving an unwanted comment or things like that. It's like, yeah, like every 9 minutes a victim of sexual assault is a child. But like how many times are children being harassed? Like less than one every 9 minutes? Like how is that a thing?
Also grooming is something, and that's a whole nother topic. So that every 9 minutes, that's just the actual physical act of the assault. If you want to try to differentiate, I know I mentioned off the top, we are going to use some language that may offend some people today, but unfortunately there's no way around it. So if you want to get technical with it, that every 9 minutes, that's basically rape. That's actual physical act being done. So that doesn't count the grooming. That doesn't count the things that are being said to them. You mentioned that difference between assault and harassment. A USA Today article I found gave this statistic, and it was important. I thought this was important because they did mention the differentiation between the two, and that was more than 1 in 4 current or former student athletes that were surveyed reported being sexually assaulted or harassed. Now, see, they made a point to say or harassed, so it's even it's even more common by someone in a position of power on campus, compared to 1 in 10 of those in quote unquote the general population outside of a college campus. And once again, that's college specific, which we're going to get into much more because we're going to get way more in depth with the Larry Nassar story, which very much involved college students at college campus, all sorts of everything. But I did find that interesting, and I found that helpful that they made sure to say it wasn't just sexually assaulted, but also harassed, because when that's a good point you brought up. The harassment is usually what predicates or happens before the actual assault. And in many cases, luckily in a lot of cases, it doesn't get to that. It stops at harassment, whether for whatever reason. But unfortunately, too, in so many cases, it does elevate into assault as well. So thank you. I'm glad you brought that up as well.
And I think with all these statistics, one of the other really important things that we got to remember is sexual trauma is so underreported. As with any trauma experience, especially gender differenced trauma experiences, we know that reports are so underreported. People are afraid to speak out. And so I think like when we see all of these statistics and feel like it's mind blowing to even think of them in the numbers that they are, like, I think it's also important to say, and there is a population who doesn't report, who we don't hear from. And so like to know that like these statistics are probably in reality even more dramatic, and like how heartbreaking it is to think like that there are people that like aren't even being counted towards these horrible, horrible statistics because they are so traumatized and afraid to even speak up and say that something has happened to them. So, I want to give a space and like credit to those people who are sitting in silence and not being counted in these statistics, and just like how horrible it must be to be in that place where you can't even raise your hand to be counted as one of the, almost 500,000 victims.
And you'll hear this a lot today. This is a good time to remind everyone. There is a National Sexual Assault Hotline.
Mm-hmm.
It is available to you whether you or a loved one is a victim of sexual assault 24 hours a day, and that phone number is 1-800-656-4673. Another important thing to note as well, too, because I think a common misconception when it comes to sexual assault is many people just assume that the aggressor is a male, the victim is a female. Yes, that tends to happen more often than not. However, and you guys are going to see this a lot today, it's not always the case. There are times where the female is the aggressor and the male is the victim. There are times where it is a male and a male. Mm-hmm. So it's not always a female being the victim at the hands of a male. It's male, male, female, female, mm-hmm. female, male. It just like so many other things when we talk about substance abuse and mental health issues. It doesn't discriminate based off of gender, mm-hmm. color, creed, religion, anything. So it's important to remember that too as well. That especially too, we talk about underreported. I think that sometimes men who may be victims may feel that they can't say anything because mm-hmm. they're a man and they're just going to be viewed as, as weak or oh, well, mm-hmm. you probably actually liked it because it was a female mm-hmm. taking. Well, no, that's not always the case. And so It's also important to remember that no matter who you are, no matter what your gender, mm-hmm. what your orientation is, what your preference is, if something was done to you mm-hmm. against your will, you need to whether you talk to somebody about it, formally report it, whatever mm-hmm. needs to be done to make sure that you're not keeping it bottled up, and we'll talk about it more towards the end of the episode. There's significant mental health ramifications mm-hmm. That can sometimes become deadly for those that do not report it, share it, talk about it, and keep it bottled up in an unhealthy manner.
Yeah, one of the statistics that we looked at was that 33% of women who are raped contemplate suicide, and 13% attempt suicide. That's significantly higher than the general population. So knowing the long-standing risk that this can have, and then even thinking about PTSD and like acute stress disorder, seeing that almost 95% of women who experience some sort of sexual trauma have like acute stress symptoms. And then many of them go on to develop PTSD, even in the year, 2 years, 3 years after, shows that this is not something that people can recover, nor should they recover from quickly, honestly. It just has a long-standing effect.
Also on that note too, and you think about, PTSD as it relates to, a lot of times people think PTSD and they think truly like horrific crimes mm-hmm. or experiences. You think of things in war, mm-hmm. witnessing, deadly accidents or something like that. And so approximately 70% of sexual assault or rape victims experience moderate to severe distress, which is a larger percentage than any other violent crime that is monitored and registered. So you think about you just think about the term violent crimes, and to think that, mm-hmm. that sexual assault causes more distress than any other crime mm-hmm. of violence.
Yep. To meet criteria for PTSD, it has to be threatened, serious harm of death to yourself, someone you know and love, or something that you witnessed, or repeated exposure. So, that feeling of like being totally helpless, victimized, not being able to stand up for yourself during a sexual trauma would, without question, meet criteria for the PTSD diagnosis. And like you said, it's often seen as something that's more experienced with those big traumas, the big T traumas, and that, like, we think like war, violence, those types of things. But, that feeling of like, my life is in danger here is really something that impacts these folks that experience this trauma.
Yeah, and also, unfortunately, another thing too is that in an overwhelming majority of the time, the aggressor is somebody that the victim knows, trusts, knows very well. There is that level of a connection there where they feel like they can let their guard down, and unfortunately, the aggressor in many instances preys and takes advantage of that to the extent of, according to childhelp.org, 90% of all child sexual abuse victims knew the perpetrator in one way, shape, or form. Beyond just children, once again, going back to that USA Today article, almost 40% of athletes who were sexually assaulted said they felt pressured not to report because they were afraid that doing so would cause them to lose their scholarship, or doubted that it would even be taken seriously if they reported it, because once again, you have a child, a young adult, coming and saying something about what everyone believes to be a very trusted, well-respected adult within the community, within the school, within the, like I said, the community as well too. And that was why, a big reason why, and we're going to get into that story in more detail shortly, but that was a big reason why Larry Nassar was able to continue his abusive ways for as long as he did, because everyone didn't want to I don't want to say didn't want to believe it, but you say, okay, well, he's a very respected doctor, trainer. Why would he do that? And we're going to get into all that here in a little bit more with that story, but also answer some of the questions as to why these aggressors do it. What goes through their mind when they are doing this. And so, it's unfortunate. Like I said, it's another reason why I wanted to do this episode today, because I think since that Larry Nassar story came out, I do think that people are paying more attention to it. That being said, I still don't think it's getting the necessary attention that it deserves to get. And so that's why we're here today talking about this.
Absolutely agree. It will never get enough attention until it stops.
Well, absolutely. That I think we can all agree on. And so we've teased it enough. We've referenced it enough. So let's kind of take a look back. Obviously, we're just kind of looking at more of some of the bigger, more relevant stories from the last several years. Unfortunately, sexual assault in sports has been happening as long as sports have been taking place. So if we could go back decades and decades and decades to find these stories, but just to keep it as most recent as possible, because that'll give people a better idea of kind of remembering what took place and jostling their memory a little bit better. And so let's go ahead and get started with that Larry Nassar case. I know you are at Ohio State University. That did take place in your part of the country, though, because he was a doctor at Michigan State University, first and foremost, in addition to being a trainer and sports doctor with USA Gymnastics specifically. When this case was playing out, obviously it took over the entire country, but I would have to imagine in your part of the country specifically, it had to have, I guess, hit home a little bit harder than it maybe did in other parts, because it was practically in your backyard.
Right. Yep. Just about 3 hours north of where I'm at currently. Yeah, it's very jarring to think someone, like Larry Nassar, who had such a prominent position and had been doing what he had been doing for so long, and to have these reports come out about what he was doing, to think about the bravery of the people who spoke up about it, but also the feelings of, what I'm sure were very mixed responses that they got. These young girls who were the, Olympic gold medalists that he had access to, people like Simone Biles and Allie Raisman, like these are the people who, eventually shared their stories and brought to light what was going on. But these are people who, from the outsider's perspective, were seen to, be successful and look at everything they have and how wonderful it is. And to find out that for years they were being, violated in such ways by somebody who had been given this position of power, as a physician, someone who we take an oath when we do this to take care of people. So just the bravery that it took for them to come out, and the fact that it took other extraneous charges to bring this to light, like the child pornography charges that then brought this to light is, I'm glad it happened, but the fact that
it took child pornography charges for this to come to light. I mean, he had been a sexually abusing athlete since the 1990s. And it was great of Simone Biles. You mentioned Ali Raisman, Michaela Maroney. They all came out. They all came out in light of this after he'd already been arrested for the child pornography charges and after they had already won Olympic gold medals. So they were already at the peak as far as their success.
Yep.
I don't want to say they were untouchable, but they were at a point where coming out and speaking wasn't going to be detrimental to their careers anymore because they had already reached the peak. And so while it was great that they were able to come out, think about the hundreds of athletes over that period of time who did not reach the peak of their profession and were not able to speak out about it because of fear that he would essentially ruin their lives and ruin their careers. And, you even look at the three of them, they did not speak out on it until it already was public knowledge from that. So even them, and you're talking about the best of the Olympic, U.S. Olympic gymnastics, members, gold medalists multiple times over, even they didn't feel comfortable speaking on it earlier than they did. Obviously, of course, as we always see with these stories, USA Gymnastics, Michigan State came out and said, they were appalled and they couldn't believe it happened under their watch and blah, blah, blah. But once again, you do have to question the people in power. And what I mentioned it, that he's well respected. He's viewed so well, they you don't want to bring negative attention to yourself until it's already too late. And so you can't help but wonder how many people within USA Gymnastics and within Michigan State kind of turned a blind eye to any sort of reporting, any sort of rumors, any sort of, oh, did you hear so-and-so, what happened with so-and-so, until, of course, obviously it was too late. And you have to wonder if somebody had said something earlier, how many more dozens of athletes could have been saved, so to say.
Yeah, one of the big indicators of someone's willingness to speak about any sort of trauma or abuse that they're experiencing is the perception of the institutional actions that they're going to take when that happens. So there's been a lot of research that shows, why do people report? Why don't they report? And the idea that they believe that if they report this sort of abuse or trauma, that their institution isn't going to do anything, often impacts people's willingness to speak up. And so, I mean, with this situation, it went on for so long, and there's so many unanswered questions, as there will be with any of these situations. But, this idea of the feeling of, if I speak up, nobody's going to do anything, and this belief that the institution isn't going to work on your behalf can really be a big deterrent for people. And so I think, there's been a lot of work since this particular case to try to improve the education around faculty and staff members, particularly within like collegiate athletics or even just college, university level education, to increase the knowledge of how to report these types of things, things to look out for that could be red flags that someone's experiencing sexual trauma. And so I think, those are positive things that have come out of that. But it still goes to the idea of everyone can have the knowledge, but until they see action, people are still going to hesitate to speak up. So I think it goes to show that if we learn of something, if we know of something, it's important to take action, because that's what's going to let people know that it's safe to speak up and not feel that they're going to be punished because they spoke on their own behalf.
Another big story that happened, and this one was reported and took place reported in 2021. It happened in 2010, involving the Chicago Blackhawks, their entire organization, from the minor leagues all the way. We found out that it went all the way from the minor leagues all the way up to the GM and the executive offices within the Blackhawks organization. For those of you who may not know what I'm talking about, may not remember, involved Brad Aldrich, who was a video coach within the Blackhawks organization. He also was a coach within the minor league system. He was sexually abusing his players. So we talk about how it wasn't always man and woman. So this case, it was a man and another man. And unfortunately, we've seen this far too often in life in hockey culture. Hockey culture already, some would argue, is a little barbaric compared to some of the other sports at times. Unfortunately, there's also far too many instances in hockey locker rooms where even if people think it's joking, there's sexual things taking place in there. And so in this case, one of the players did report it anonymously, and then nothing really happened. Then we had another player come out, Kyle Beach, who did report it. He put his name on it. He reported it out into the public. And then after that happened, that's kind of when everything blew up. The team conducted the team conducted an investigation. It resulted in a pretty significant, pretty jarring report, I should say, within the entire Blackhawks organization, because this was happening at the same time when they went on their Stanley Cup run. So everyone thought, they're the Stanley Cup champions. We learned that below the surface there was a lot of truly horrific and despicable things going on. As a result, many executives were fired, including the general manager, Stan Bowman, the team president, John McDonough. They were fired within the Blackhawks organization. And then it stemmed even further than that. There were several executives and coaches that had been with the Blackhawks organization at that time who had moved on to different teams. Those teams had to part ways with those people as well. That even happened down here in South Florida with the Panthers at the time. Joel Quenneville was the coach. And after the story came out, they let him go. It was about 12 or 13 games into the season, and they had to make a change and bring in interim for the rest of that season before moving on to their current coach they have now. But, once again, so there were guys fired. The team was fined $2 million, but at the end of the day, they didn't lose their Stanley Cup championship. Obviously I'm sure there were many fans of the team that may not be fans anymore. There's no arguing that what happened was truly despicable. At the end of the day, luckily, to the best of my knowledge, I don't believe any of the executives involved have found new jobs within the league. So at least I guess you could say justice was served from the standpoint of their careers ended. Mm-hmm. Within the NHL, obviously, they can still go and get jobs anywhere else in the private sector. Nobody served jail time, unlike the Larry Nassar story. So this one was a little bit different. Mm-hmm. Once again, though, this one took 11 years. 11 years. So it happened in 2010. It was finally investigated in 2021. So just like Larry Nassar started in the 90s, we didn't find out about it until 2016. This one not quite as long, 2010 to 2011, but that's still over 10 years before it came out, before the information came out. And had it not been for Kyle Beach, who knows if it ever, unfortunately, would have come out, because the other player, like I said, was anonymous, a John Doe, who tried to report it internally, and nothing came of it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. There's always a big thing a lot of folks report is this fear of retaliation. A fear that it's going to get worse, a fear that people are going to turn a blind eye. But there's also this idea of like institutional betrayal, kind of like reminds me of like The Godfather, like you betrayed the family, like that kind of thing. And I think, sports teams are such close-knit groups that it's almost this idea of like, we handle things inside, we don't talk about it, everything's in hushed tones. And like, if you do speak out, it's like you've betrayed the group. And I think that's what keeps a lot of people quiet for a long time is, that feeling of betrayal. Cause like, for many of these elite athletes, your team is your family. So much of your life is spent in the walls of, the sports facility with the people that you're, engaged with for practice or in the games with. And so I think this idea of, but what if I lose my family? What if I lose my friends? What if I speak up and people don't believe me and I lose my only support that I know? And, I think in this situation, it's this idea of, the first person to step forward was so concerned, like they didn't even feel comfortable using their own name. Like, this idea of you have so much to lose when you speak up. And I think, this even, playing professional sports doesn't protect you from, the potential to lose everything you've worked for if you speak up against an institution that's not going to come to your defense. So I think,
and specifically in those two players, they were fringe players. So like we talked about, Allie Raceman and Simone Biles. I mean, they were once again top of their profession, gold medalists.
Mm-hmm.
These were fringe NHL players. So they were the guys that were constantly going back and forth between the NHL team, the minor leagues, bouncing around from team to team. So they were players where, like you mentioned, if they had gone out and said something, would that have been at the end of their careers? Would the Blackhawks have just cut them loose, and the rest of the teams in the league said, "Well, this is just a distraction. We don't want to deal with now for the quality of player that they are." Just and there goes that's it. There goes their career. They're done. Thanks for coming. Here's a lovely parting gift. I hate to say it in those terms, but that's what those particular players were dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The idea that you could lose it all to stand up for yourself. But if you don't stand up for yourself, you're losing so much as well. So it's very much like stuck between a rock and a hard place situation for these people. So unfair.
Yeah. And so we have two more stories, and these two are currently playing out in the news right now. So we don't have all the facts on them. There are still things coming out that we're waiting to find out. But the first one, and this story broke a couple weeks ago, now it's been, involving five professional hockey players that were on part of the 2018 Canada junior hockey team that were playing in the IHF World Junior Championships in Buffalo, New York at the time. There was a report that these five players sexually assaulted a woman. This woman supposedly went to the authorities, and for whatever reason, whether the paperwork slipped through the proverbial cracks or whatever happened, it fell by the wayside. It took a long time for anything to happen, and recently now the case resurfaced, and so the players accused, once again we say accused because this story is still ongoing. They have surrendered. There is now a investigation happening, but we're saying accused because they have not been convicted of anything yet. But those players are Dylan Dubé of the Calgary Flames, Cal Foote and Michael McLeod of the New Jersey Devils, Carter Hart of the Philadelphia Flyers, and Alex Formenton, who is currently playing pro hockey over in Switzerland. So 4 NHL players, 1 playing over in Europe. All 5 players have currently been charged with 1 count each of sexual assault. And McLeod faces an additional charge of being a party to the offense, which police said was for aiding someone else in committing the offense that we don't have a name of yet. Obviously, Hockey Canada, of course, after the fact, has come out and said, they're supporting the investigation. They're appalled. Obviously, their sympathies to the victim. It's all great things to say after the fact. Unfortunately, once again, though, nothing was done in real time. Yeah.
Yep. It is just another, pushing the paper around situation. In many ways, it feels like, for people to live this individual who experienced the assault to live for 6 years, and wonder where the paperwork is, wonder when the call is going to happen. That's hard to live in. I can only imagine. But one of the things I was struck by when we were doing the research for this show was the number of associations that had come out with statements about, their beliefs about sexual assault in sports and athletics. And just as someone who doesn't understand these things all that well, it always kind of makes me laugh to think, why do we have to have a statement about that? Shouldn't we just know? Shouldn't we just know how we feel about this? Why do we have to have a published statement? And, to see that these groups are coming out with these statements after these things are happening is just, it is discouraging in many ways. And I'm glad we're making a statement, but let's make these statements just a little bit sooner, guys, just a little bit sooner. And I was looking at some of the prevention systems that are in place to prevent sexual assault and sexual assault perpetration, and seeing how few prevention systems are associated with actual sports leagues. Less than around a quarter are associated and implemented within sports leagues, which was a pretty jarring thing to me, to think that we're not using significant numbers of prevention programs in these realms.
And this one was particularly damning to me too, because the 4 NHL players all obviously took leaves of absences from their team, which, hey, when you have to go turn yourself into Canadian police, you kind of can't be traveling with your team. But
sure.
The way that the Calgary Flames particularly handled it with Dylan Dubé was particularly upsetting and troubling to me, because in the statement they released, the reasoning for giving him his indefinite leave of absence was what they put at the time so he could address his mental health. And the fact that we are talking about somebody who was an aggressor of sexual assault now using and leaning on that mental health excuse for why he's leaving the team, to me, that was just, it was truly sickening. And that's not to say that he wasn't mentally struggling with the fact that he had to turn himself into authorities, but let's not pretend that he was the victim here in this. His mental health issues were brought on because he allegedly sexually assaulted a woman. And once again, that doesn't mean that he can't be mentally struggling, but let's not play him to be the victim here in this release saying, oh, well, he's taking some time away to address his mental health concerns. No, he's not. He's taking leave of absence because he's wanted by Canadian police for a sexual assault. What are we doing here? And this is another example, and I think we've talked about it, you and I, in previous episodes. I know I've addressed this in previous episodes as well, too. We're trying to make mental health issues and needing to take leaves of absences and to take time away from mental health to be taken seriously. Right. And I feel like this is doing the opposite of that when you're throwing out mental health as like a blanket term for somebody who has to turn themselves into authorities because of a sexual assault allegation.
Yeah. It's mental health has for so long been stigmatized as, we can't see it, so it's not real. It's not really a struggle. Just pull yourselves up by the bootstraps and carry on. And, it's taken a long time to get to the place where we are, where people can actually get resources and treatment for their mental health concerns, particularly from traumas that for so long were not seen as valid or seen as the fault of the person who experienced them, which is, I'm glad we've moved past that, but wow, just to think that we've even been there. But, to invalidate the experience of a victim for the perpetrator it's a unique choice. It's a unique choice, not one that I would make.
Yeah, it's just, I feel like for all the positive progression we've made when it comes to the mental health conversation, I almost feel like we just took a giant step backwards by them throwing out the mental health
correct
line.
It's an easy scapegoat.
It is, but it's just, and once again, I'm not arguing that he's not. I mean, listen, that's a trying time. Once again, at the end of the day, he is a human being. He has mental health issues like the rest of us. I don't doubt that he is struggling mentally right now because of the fact that he now may lose his freedom because of this.
Jail is scary.
Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that you can just, especially as a professional sports organization, just throw that out as a blanket.
Correct.
Excuse, reason. If you as an organization and as a league really want to take a stand and say this is not okay, then say, hey, look, he's gone from the team because he's currently under investigation for a sexual abuse charge. We don't condone sexual abuse. Correct. We think this is,
right. This does not align with our values.
Yeah. Anything. And so it was particularly upsetting to see that come out as part of the statement.
Yeah. Not the best move on a publicist situation.
Yeah, you do have to question who was calling the shots on creating that statement. That's for sure. The moving on here, and this one, I mean, you want to talk about appalling and just awful. I apologize in advance for this one because there's going to be no way to sugarcoat what some of the allegations were here. So once again, I talked about it earlier. We mentioned it before. Things may get graphic here. So just trigger warning once again. I think we've done a pretty good job of trying to choose our words wisely here. There's going to be no way around really doing that here coming up. And that involves Vince McMahon and the WWE and the current criminal investigation that he is under. All these stories so far have been strictly sexual assault, sexual abuse related. This one goes further than that and goes actually into trafficking allegations as well too. I don't even know where to begin with this one. The report was truly jarring. One of the particularly awful stories to me that came out was the report from this woman who filed her lawsuit that she was involved with Vince McMahon and another gentleman in a sexual encounter. Vince McMahon defecated on her during that encounter and then required her to finish up the rest of the encounter, if you will, before essentially cleaning herself up. That was just one of the truly horrific stories that came out of this. I honestly didn't take down much notes for this one because it's still very, very early on. There's still a lot we haven't found out, and also it's just truly sickening. All the I almost didn't want to have to go through all of it to make notes of it for myself again, because it's just and mind you, this was the latest lawsuit that came out and the latest victim to come out. It's been historically known that Vince McMahon has done truly deplorable and despicable things for going on 30 years now, whether it's treatment of the athletes, sexual whatnot. So this isn't anything new. This is the most jarring and most graphic information to come out currently. But once again, and in this case, unlike all the other situations where in many cases it was somebody in a position of power, this is a guy who not only was the owner of the company, obviously, but he had a wealth that was so great that I truly think in his mind he thought that he really could do anything he wanted and face no real repercussions from it, because if he needed to, he could just throw money at the problem and make it go away. And I think for almost his entire life, he was successful with that one until he wasn't with this particular lawsuit that's currently playing out right now.
I think with this one too, one of the other complicating factors is he's the face, right? He's the face of the WWE. He's been the leader, the person on TV, the voice that we all recognize. And so I think, in the first three cases that we talked about, it was kind of background stuff that happened behind closed doors, people in different separate offices. Whereas this was like somebody who was featured prominently. You're the one representing the company,
And from all reports too, it was happening out in the open. He was basically bragging about it to anyone who would listen to him, anyone who was in an earshot or he could text, or he was basically bragging about this with too, which it's only a matter of time now. I'm sure as this story continues to plays out, we're going to find out about a lot of other big names who knew something that kept their mouths shut and will probably end up being consequences for them as well too. But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
He was basically bragging about it too, which made it even worse.
Right. And it complicates it because, the people who knew, there's that responsible part of that. But then it again goes back to when he's the one that holds the purse strings, he's the one who calls the shots. These are people who have dreamed of being professional wrestlers for their whole lives. I mean, since they were children. And so, you speak about the person who's in charge in an ill way, you could lose everything really, really quickly. And so it makes you think like, we want everyone to feel comfortable speaking up on the behalf of anybody who's experiencing these things, but it also gives you that level of sympathy to say like, I can see where that fear would come from. I can see where that fear of like self-protection and self-preservation would come from. So like, yeah, he's talking about this horrible, deplorable thing to you, but at the same time, like you have a family to feed. Like you have people who you have to take care of, and to feel like your whole career that you've worked for could get ripped away from you. And like for many years, jeopardy.
Yeah. And for many years it was a private company. So he was literally the judge, jury, and executioner. Like there was no climbing the ladder. And even when it became a public company and there was a board of directors, he was the head of the board. His family members, his daughter, his son-in-law were on the board. So it's like I said, I think from a financial perspective, from a public perspective, and from also being the only game in town perspective too, because let's not forget, post 2001 until very recently, if you were a professional wrestler and you wanted to do that for a living, you're the only game in town. That was your only option, was the WWE. Yep. You could work for some of these smaller promotions or be an independent person and bounce around, but you were making maybe $100 or $200 a night. If you wanted to be a full-time employed professional wrestler with a steady check and money to feed your that was it. So you was basically keep your mouth shut or you're out of a job. And unlike so many of these other situations where, yes, as a hockey player, maybe there's another team they could have gone to. There was no option B for them if they lost their job because they spoke up.
Yeah. And the other thing with the WWE is wrestling, it's not my game.
Yeah. It's not for everybody. I understand. Yeah.
It's not for me normally. But there's characters, right? Like there's storylines that aren't reality. And so I think that also makes it fuzzy for people of like, wait, is this the real or is this the character? Is this the story or is this the reality? And so I think too, that makes it fuzzy of like, I'm not sure if what we're talking about is like true or what this is about, and that makes it so much more complicated in many ways. I would have to imagine.
Especially with professional wrestling with their characters, a lot of the best wrestlers, their characters are them turned up to 100, they always say. Yeah. Or they get so deep into their character that their character's behavior and actions bleed into their real life. Mm-hmm. We saw that happen with Ric Flair in that documentary, that 30 for 30. He in front of the camera, he was Ric Flair, the wrestler, and at home, he was Ric Flair, and at some point, Ric Flair, the wrestler, became his entire life. And even when the camera was off, he still had that persona going. So, and especially when you think about in the late 90s and early 2000s, when that Mr. McMahon character went from, he was just the owner to, he was the on-screen villainous boss, CEO, everyone, and so you have to think that beyond just is this the Vince McMahon character or the Vince McMahon human? Like everybody else, you'd have to imagine that character bled into his real life in terms of the way he behaved, even when the camera was turned off.
Yeah.
Once again, not that I'm condoning it, not that it makes it any better, but it just sometimes it helps if you can try to understand where these people are coming from. And I think that's a great transition too, that I wanted to finish up the show here because we are kind of running long here.
Sure.
Mentally. So, also really quick, one other thing I want to point out, these were very specific stories that blew up and got major mainstream attention. Mm-hmm. Anyone who follows sports on the regular, you guys know that an athlete sexually assaulting or sexually abusing, whether it's their partner, someone they know, unfortunately, it happens way too often. I think it happens so often now that it's not even a blip. Like, it's just like, hey, this so-and-so got arrested for this, and then he bailed out, and okay, cool. Is he going to play this week or not? And unfortunately, it happens far too often. Obviously, these stories getting the attention does help bring more light to it, but it happens far more than just what is reported. So really quick, though, to transition. So you have these aggressors. Mm-hmm. I would like to think and hope that they know that what they're doing is wrong and they still do it anyway. I'm sure there's some of them maybe don't fully understand that what they're doing is wrong. With what you do in your line of work, you unfortunately see both sides far too often. Can you kind of take us almost into the mindset of an aggressor, of why they think that even if they know it's wrong, why they still do it anyway? Or also, if they don't think it's wrong, what is going on in their brain to make them not think that it's wrong?
Sure. Yeah. So, the reason someone could perpetrate sexual violence against someone is multifactorial in so many ways. One of the big risk factors for perpetrating sexual violence is being a victim of sexual violence. So the idea that maybe this person experienced sexual violence in childhood, that they have been assaulted themselves, that does put someone at pretty high risk of perpetrating it down the line. Other things that can contribute to this are things like substances. Intoxication on substances is definitely going to impair judgment. Never justifiable in any realm, but that lack of mental clarity, that lack of frontal lobe control to tell us what is right and what is wrong is often a contributing factor here as well. And I think some of it is societal pressure to, be masculine, look masculine, take what you want. But I think the reasons behind perpetrating something like this are so complex and can really be very complicated. But I think a lot of it comes back to the idea of like hurt people. And, the idea of, there's mental health concerns that contribute to these things. There's substance use, there's past trauma, there's current trauma, all things to boil up together that can prompt someone to perpetrate these types of violent crimes.
And then on the reverse side of that, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, but maybe we can get a little more in depth into it here. What happens in the mind of the victim after it happens? Whether, even if they don't necessarily report it, you brought up a little bit about PTSD, but what have you typically seen as far as the mental side of the victim?
Yeah. So, big things that victims of sexual trauma might display that could be signs or things to kind of look out for if you have concerns that someone would be is a victim of sexual trauma would be like if they're athletes, decrease in the amount that they're engaged in the sport, withdraw from social circles, social isolation, but then also mental health things if they're depressed, if they're anxious, if they're more compulsive, if they start to exhibit signs of eating disorders, trauma signs, if there's any concern for STIs or pregnancy that's unexpected, that the person, has kind of a washy story about, that would be big red flags. Within those who have experienced sexual trauma, they have a 22 times higher likelihood of developing an eating disorder. Part of that comes from this feeling of lack of control being converted to like high level of control to try to help calm that anxiety. But other things like PTSD type symptoms that someone might experience would be things like, if they're hyper aroused, if they feel like they startle a lot, if they're avoiding potential triggers, having nightmares, socially isolating. You notice that they're more depressed. And these are all in combination things that increase somebody who's experienced sexual trauma's risk of suicide. We know that these folks are at high risk for the stress and trauma kind of taking over and leading them to think that it would be easier if they weren't alive anymore. So it really shows the importance of early intervention and like having a safe route for them to seek treatment. With all of these, that common theme is the idea of institutional support, right? The idea that if I'm experiencing this, I can go to someone who's in charge and tell them and know that something's going to happen, but then also know that I'm going to receive the care that I need. And it, is really speaks to the need of some of these major sports leagues to have these resources for athletes in order to make sure that they're getting follow-up treatment after they've experienced the trauma, not just say, cool, thanks for telling us, we'll take care of it. Now carry on and make us money by playing this sport. Like it's really making sure that they get the follow-up treatment that they need because the consequences can be so long-lasting and so dramatic.
And once again, for everyone out there, if you are the victim of sexual assault or somebody that is, please go get the help that you need. Help is available. There is the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673. I know we've been giving that number out a lot today, but it's important. Once again, 1-800-656-4673. Dr. Natalie Klag, thank you so much for joining me today and having this conversation. I know it was a rough one, but it was very important. I think we need to keep getting the word out there that sexual assault, obviously needs to be addressed, but unfortunately for the victims, there are ways for them to be able to get the help so that they don't have to live with they don't have to live with the trauma alone, so to say. Obviously, you can't take back what happened, but you can do things to help yourself.
Absolutely. Yep. It's important just to make sure that we let people know you're not alone. There is hope. There is help. But taking that step forward can be the hardest first step, and there's support to do that. So if that's you, please get help, please.
That'll do it for this episode of the Victor of Vices podcast. Thank you once again to Dr. Natalie Klag for joining me. I know we've talked about it earlier, but I just would like to mention one last time on the way out here that if you or a loved one has been the victim of sexual assault, please call the National Sexual Assault Hotline. It is available any time that you need it. That phone number is 1-800-656-4673. Once again, that phone number, 1-800-656-4673. Thank you all for tuning in this week, and we'll talk to you next time. Have a good one, everybody.